The Calton Tongs didn't appear overnight. Their rise was forged in the chaos of post-war Glasgow, a city fractured by poverty, crumbling housing, and deepening class divides. After World War II, Glasgow was no longer the proud industrial powerhouse it once was. Shipbuilding had begun its slow collapse, and unemployment hit the working class hardest. For families in places like Calton, survival was a daily struggle. The tenement blocks that lined the streets of East Glasgow weren't just overcrowded, they were decaying. Families of 8 or more were squeezed into 2 rooms with no indoor plumbing, damp walls, and shared toilets in filthy courtyards. Disease spreads easily, so did hopelessness. For the children growing up in these conditions, the world felt rigged against them. Respect wasn't inherited, it had to be taken, and for many, that meant fighting. In this combustible atmosphere, the seeds of the Calton Tongs were planted. What began as informal street crews of boys defending their closes and wins quickly evolved into something darker. These were not one-off scuffles. They were battles for pride, territory, and reputation. By the early 1950s, these young men had adopted the name Tongs, perhaps inspired by American gangster films, or perhaps simply a street echo of menace. The name stuck, and with it came a brand of fear that swept across Glasgow. The city's nickname at the time, No Mean City, wasn't just tabloid flair, it was grounded in truth. The 1930s had seen the dominance of razor gangs, most infamously the Billy Boys. These older gangs had set a precedent: violence as structure, territory as identity, and fear as currency. But the Tongs were a new generation. They weren't just inheriting violence, they were reinventing it. By the mid-1950s, the Calton Tongs had established dominance over their patch in East Glasgow. Unlike other gangs who dissolved into the working world, the Tongs became embedded in the local culture. They operated with a twisted sense of purpose, patrolling their turf, punishing perceived disrespect, and enforcing brutal loyalty. Their motto, chanted across alleyways and painted on walls, was infamous: Tongs Ya Bass. The phrase was cryptic. Some claimed Ya Bass was short for "you bastard," a guttural insult. Others believed it was rooted in older Scots slang. Whatever the origin, it functioned like a verbal grenade, designed to provoke, to stake claim, to terrify. If you heard it shouted across the street, you knew violence was about to erupt. But behind the bravado and blades was something deeper. The Calton Tongs were a product of systemic neglect. They were children of a city that had failed to protect or uplift them. With few role models, no economic opportunity, and no trust in authority, the gang became their surrogate family. Violence wasn't just a tool, it was their language, their structure, their power. While the wider world looked down on them as thugs, within the streets of Calton, they were seen by some as defenders. They kept rival gangs out, they settled disputes swiftly, and they offered young boys something many had never known: belonging. Violence wasn't just a byproduct of gang life in Glasgow, it was the currency. And for the Calton Tongs, it was a way to build status, enforce loyalty, and establish control. In the narrow streets and backcourts of the East End, brutality became a language, spoken fluently by teenage boys who'd grown up watching older gang members earn fear and respect through force. The Tongs didn't need guns to assert dominance. Their weapons were crude but effective: flick knives, sharpened screwdrivers, bike chains, bricks, and broken bottles. Even the classic cutthroat razor, iconic from the days of earlier Glasgow gangs, still made an appearance. Blades were often hidden in socks or stitched into jacket linings, always ready for a street skirmish. Initiation was rarely formal, but violence was a rite of passage. Young recruits were expected to prove themselves, sometimes through a bold act, like ambushing a rival or slashing a known enemy. The more brutal the act, the faster the respect came. For the Tongs, pain was proof of loyalty. Territory was everything. You didn't just walk into Calton from Bridgeton or Maryhill without knowing someone or risking a beating. This wasn't about organized crime or money, not yet. It was about identity, pride, and the idea that the street you were born on meant everything. Loyalty to the gang often outweighed loyalty to family. There was also a strange sense of honor among the violence. Gang members wouldn't typically harm civilians unless they were seen as traitors, informants, or disrespectful. In their twisted moral code, violence wasn't random, it was strategic. Intimidate outsiders, protect your own. Police struggled to keep up. Many officers simply refused to patrol Calton alone. They were met with silence, stone faces, and the knowledge that even if they arrested one youth, 2 more would replace him by week's end. When they did intervene, it often sparked more violence, sometimes against the officers themselves. What made the Tongs particularly dangerous was their cohesion. These weren't chaotic mobs. They moved with intent. They organized fights, they used lookouts, they planned exits, they understood the terrain. brain, every alley, stairwell, and shortcut. Fear was their greatest weapon, and once that fear took root, the Tongs didn't have to fight every battle, they just had to be known for winning them. The Calton Tongs didn't operate in isolation. Glasgow in the mid-20th century was a patchwork of gang territories, each marked by its own code, history, and vendettas. And when lines were crossed, retribution was swift, brutal, and often public. Their fiercest and most legendary adversaries, the Santoy gang from the Gorbals. If Calton was fire, the Gorbals was gasoline. Clashes between the two weren't just scuffles, they were orchestrated assaults. These weren't turf wars over drugs or money. They were about dominance, pride, and revenge. Violence became a cycle. One stabbing led to another, one ambush to a counterattack. The city turned into a chessboard soaked in blood. In one infamous showdown, more than 100 young men stormed Duke Street, armed with razors, chains, bats, and bricks. It was daylight. Traffic stopped. Shops shut their doors. Residents bolted themselves inside. When it was over, dozens were bleeding. Not one arrest was made. The Tongs also faced off with gangs from Postle Park, Bridgeton, Maryhill, and Black Hill. Each of these groups had their own loyal crews, hardened by the same poverty and neglect. But few could match the Tongs' intensity or willingness to take violence into the open. And these battles weren't always fought with fists or blades. Firebombing of homes and clubs weren't uncommon. Stabbings happened outside schools, community halls, even churches. What set the Tongs apart was their precision. They didn't strike without purpose. Every act of aggression was a message. Some Tongs were so feared, their names alone were enough to clear a street. Others wore their scars as badges of honor. One look at their faces, broken noses, slashed cheeks, missing teeth, told you where they stood in the gang's pecking order. For outsiders, these feuds seemed senseless, but to the Tongs, every grudge mattered. Every insult had a price. The gangs didn't need a reason to retaliate, just a name, a face, or a postcode. In Glasgow, revenge wasn't an act, it was a ritual. You didn't just join the Calton Tongs, you were absorbed into them. For many young boys in East Glasgow, the path into the gang wasn't a choice, it was the air they breathed. Kids as young as 11 or 12 were watched closely by older Tongs. A nod on the street, a test of nerve, a whispered dare outside school. That's how it started. Before long, they were running errands, carrying weapons, or acting as lookouts. Their real initiation came when blood hit the ground. One former member recounted being told to slice a rival's face in the middle of a crowded tenement stairwell. You want in, they said, leave a mark. That was the price of respect. You didn't ask questions, you did what you were told, and quickly. But it wasn't all about violence. There was a twisted structure in place. Senior members gave orders, passed down rules, and handed out punishments. Disobedience wasn't taken lightly. Step out of line, and you'd feel the consequences, sometimes from your own crew. Family ties only deepened the indoctrination. In many Calton households, gang life was inherited. Sons of ex-members were almost expected to pick up where their fathers left off. Mothers stayed silent. Brothers watched proudly. Uncles gave advice on where to hide the blade. This wasn't a club, it was a lineage. Some boys joined out of fear, others out of desperation, but a surprising number joined for belonging. In a world where jobs were scarce, homes were crumbling, and futures were foggy, the Tongs offered a twisted form of purpose. They turned nobodies into somebody, even if that somebody was feared more than loved. In schoolyards, the Tongs recruited with ease. Teachers saw the shift, the hunched posture, the sudden aggression, the fresh cuts hidden under uniform blazers, but they were powerless. By the time the signs were visible, it was already too late. The Tongs didn't just build an army, they built a belief system, one based on loyalty, violence, and survival. And once you were in, there was no going back. It wasn't just a chant, it was a warning, a brand, and a war cry rolled into one. Tongs Ya Bass. 3 words that echoed through Glasgow's alleyways, burned into its walls, and slipped from the mouths of kids who'd never even seen a blade. The phrase was everywhere. It was shouted before fights, whispered before attacks, and scratched into school desks, pub toilets, and prison walls. Ask 10 people what it meant, and you'd get 10 different answers. Some swore Ya Bass was short for you bastard. Others claimed it was rooted in Scottish slang, part insult, part dare. But to the people in Calton, the exact definition didn't matter. What mattered was the fear it triggered. Graffiti covered buildings like war paint. Tongs Ya Bass wasn't just a slogan, it marked territory. If that tag appeared near your tenement, you knew who ran the block. Rival gangs understood the message. Cross this line and you're not walking back. Even police officers admitted that seeing the words scrawled across brick and steel meant bracing for trouble. And the slogan didn't stop in the streets, it seeped into the culture. Local bands used it. It popped up in comedy sketches, tabloid headlines, and underground zines. years. It became part of Glasgow's dialect, passed down like folklore. You didn't have to be a gang member to say it, but when you did, you carried a piece of the Tongs legend. For many, the phrase offered a kind of twisted pride. Boys who had never set foot in Calton would scrawl it on their school books. It gave them a sense of toughness, like putting on armor. It was the illusion of invincibility, borrowed from a name they barely understood. But for those who lived it, it meant something else entirely. Tongs Ya Bass wasn't about ego. It was about reputation, survival, identity. It was a call to arms, and a promise that when the Tongs came for you, they wouldn't come alone. By the late 1960s, Glasgow streets were soaked in fear, and the name Tongs had become too loud to ignore. The violence wasn't just a local problem anymore, it was national news. Hospitals were treating knife wounds like common colds. Teachers were losing students to the streets. Police officers were outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and out of time. The tipping point came when the violence spilled into public spaces, church steps, cinemas, schoolyards. It was no longer just gang on gang. Bystanders were getting caught in the crossfire. Something had to give, and the city gave the order: clean it up. Police chiefs launched Operation Clean Sweep, an aggressive, multi-agency crackdown on gang crime. Undercover officers were planted in schools, clubs, and pubs. Informants were paid. Surveillance teams monitored known hotspots in Calton and beyond. Raids became weekly. Batons replaced warnings. But it wasn't easy. Tongs members were raised not to speak. Snitching was worse than death. Even victims refused to testify, so officers relied on other tools: fingerprints on broken bottles, blood patterns in alleyways, and meticulous documentation. Bit by bit, the evidence piled up. One of the first big wins came when a senior Tongs figure was caught red-handed after a stabbing outside a bingo hall. He was sentenced to over a decade in prison. That conviction opened the floodgates. Others followed: leaders, lookouts, runners. The courts were flooded with young men barely old enough to shave, facing charges that could keep them behind bars for life. But law enforcement didn't stop at arrests. They went after the roots. Youth outreach programs sprang up across the East End. Local churches and schools became hubs for intervention. Former gang members were brought in to speak, warning younger kids what waited at the end of the road. The message was simple: the Tongs only gave you two futures, prison or a coffin. Simultaneously, Glasgow began transforming physically. The same tenements that birthed the Tongs were bulldozed, replaced with housing schemes on the city's fringes. Families were relocated. Lifelong neighbors were separated. The web of loyalty that had held the gangs together was stretched to its limits, and in some places, it snapped. The Tongs didn't disappear overnight, but the war had turned. With each arrest, each demolition, and each child steered away from the path, their grip loosened. By the mid-1970s, the Calton Tongs were no longer kings of the street. They were legends of a darker time. The era of Tongs Ya Bass was fading, but its echoes would never fully die. The Calton Tongs might be gone, but their shadow lingers. Their story has become part of Glasgow's folklore. Books, documentaries, and stage plays have explored their legacy. Former members have spoken out, reflecting on a time when violence felt like the only option. One of the most telling examples of their legacy is how their name lives on in Glasgow slang. To this day, older Glaswegians will refer to someone as a bit of a Tong to mean they're tough, wild, or unpredictable. And there's no denying the impact on policy. Glasgow's approach to youth intervention and community policing today is, in many ways, a reaction to the gang epidemic that once plagued it. The Calton Tongs were a product of their time, but their influence rippled far beyond it. Their rise and fall is more than just gang history. It's a story of poverty, identity, and a city wrestling with its own demons. They came from the streets of Calton, carved their name into Glasgow's history, and left behind a legacy of fear, pride, and power. The Tongs may no longer roam the alleys, but the echoes of Tongs Ya Bass still whisper through the city's walls. Stay safe, stay curious, and if you hear that chant in the wind, maybe walk a little faster.